I am Jacob Schrum from Southwestern University in Texas, and this research combines compositional pattern producing networks with generative adversarial networks. I did this research with Vanessa Volz from Model AI and Sebastian Risi, who is also at Model AI as well as a professor at IT University Copenhagen. The motivation for this work is that generative adversarial networks are proving to be a powerful indirect encoding for evolution. You provide a training set, and then the GAN is able to learn to imitate that data and produce convincing fakes. But the problem with GANs is that they have a limited scale. The output dimension is fixed, so you can only produce examples of a certain fixed size. Now what you can do is take several of these and stitch them together, but if you do that, there isn't necessarily any cohesion or consistent pattern across the segments. And that is where compositional pattern producing networks come in. They are able to encode large-scale patterns with symmetry, repetition, and variation, as seen in these random examples here. And in this paper, we apply this combination to both Mario and Zelda, producing large levels with visible patterns. Now, lots of previous work has been done with CPPNs. They've been used to generate beautiful 2D pictures, 3D shapes, 2D and 3D animations, as well as soft-bodied robots, particle effects for a space shooting video game, and these aesthetically pleasing flowers for a social media game, as well as many other examples. So they're firmly established means of producing patterns. GANs are a bit newer, and in particular, they were first applied to video games in 2018 by me and several other researchers who are also co-authors on this paper. We applied a GAN to Mario and evolved better levels. Since then, others have done this with Doom, with an educational video game, with the general video game AI version of Zelda, shown here, and most recently, my student will be presenting at CEC this year on how to use a GAN to create the rooms for Zelda and then combine them using a graph grammar. Now, in the paper I'm presenting today, instead of using a graph grammar to combine rooms into a dungeon, we use CPPNs. So how do those work? Well, CPPNs are basically arbitrary topology neural networks with multiple activation functions. In particular, it's important to have representatives of symmetric functions, asymmetric functions, and repetitive functions like these examples shown here. The other important thing about CPPNs is how they are used. They are repeatedly queried across some coordinate frame. So in this simple example, we only have x and y coordinates and thus a 2D coordinate frame. This image is the intensity map associated with this neuron here. Because x is the only input, this 2D image is showing us the intensity of sine of x. This neuron's output is shown here, so we have the intensity of the sine of y. And because we only have y here, we have horizontal stripes, and because we only have x here, we have vertical stripes. This final output neuron takes input from both of those, so it is adding those two together, and the activation function here is identity, so we're simply combining those two to get this combined intensity pattern. And assuming that all the weights on these links are 1, that is the pattern we would get. And so this demonstrates how different patterns are composed by CPPNs to create large-scale patterns. So they have awareness of geometry. Also, they can encode things at arbitrary resolution because we can decide how many pixels per a given space we query them with. Now we evolve CPPNs using NEAT, that is Neuroevolution of Augmenting Topologies. NEAT is a famous algorithm, supports crossover and several mutations. The mutations do things like changing the link weights, splicing new neurons along links, joining neurons together with new links, and when using CPPNs, we add a mutation that changes the activation function in a neuron for another one. The specific activation functions used in this work are listed here. That's quite a long list. You don't necessarily need to use all of those, but it is important to once again have representatives of symmetric, asymmetric, and repeating functions. GANs work by training two separate networks simultaneously, a generator and a discriminator. The purpose of the generator is to take some number of random noise variables as input and generate an output that has the same size and shape as members of some training set of real examples. The goal of the discriminator is to distinguish the real examples from the fake examples. At first, both the generator and the discriminator are bad, and so neither of them will do a very good job. As time goes on, they both improve, but when done right, the generator will improve to the point where the discriminator really has no ability to distinguish the fake examples from the real examples. Therefore, at the end of training, the discriminator is worthless, and the generator is skilled at forging new examples that look like they came from the training set, even though they're original. The other element of this research is the multidimensional archive of phenotypic elites. This is the evolutionary algorithm we're using. And so rather than use a direct objective-based algorithm, we're using a quality diversity algorithm because we want to see how expressive our new encoding is by seeing how it fills out the space of possible solutions. Now, to use map elites, you have to define some dimensions of variation for your phenotypes, and then also come up with a way of discretizing that space into bins, because the way the algorithm works is that we randomly pick individuals from random bins, and then they create offspring, and the offspring might end up in a different bin, or it might end up in the same bin. But for every bin in the space, we only keep the individual with the best fitness. And by doing that, we cover a wide variety of niches in the space of possible phenotypes. Before we can evolve anything, though, we have to train our GANs. So we have one for Mario and Zelda. The one for Mario is trained by taking levels that are represented in this text-based format that comes from the video game level corpus. We take a window of this size and slide it across the input and convert the characters into this numeric coding, which is then input to the discriminator using a one-hot encoding. The generator, as always, accepts random noise and generates inputs to the discriminator, and we eventually get a generator that can produce Mario slices of this size. We can visualize these in the Mario AI framework, and if we want to have longer levels, we can simply patch multiple latent vectors together in sequence to get multiple level outputs in a row. The tiles used in Mario are shown there. Zelda is a bit more complicated. The VGLC representation of Zelda has a representative of each dungeon in the game, but what we do is we extract the individual rooms and train on those. So the rooms are converted to this numeric format, which is fed into the discriminator. The generator works as before, so that at the end we have a generator that can produce individual rooms. Now we still need a way to combine those rooms, but once we do that, we can visualize it and play it in this simple roguelike engine. And I do want to point out that among the tiles used for Zelda, we simplify things a little bit. So things like walls and blocks are functionally the same and therefore map to the same tile. And also we have doors and stairs here which are going to be removed from the level representation and turned into walls. And the reason for that is that we are only going to let the GAN define the floor space of the rooms. The connectivity of the rooms is going to be determined by the CPPN. And so we don't want doors that lead to nowhere, so we only let doors be placed by the CPPN. And here's how that works. Our approach, CPPN to GAN, takes a coordinate frame. Here it's scaled from -1 to 1 in both the x and y dimensions. And so each room has coordinates. We feed those into our CPPN. The third input, R, is the distance from the center of the dungeon. That allows us to easily make radial patterns like the one that you can see here. And we have two types of outputs coming out of the CPPN. One category are latent variables, so we have 10 here, and the other are auxiliary variables. So the latent variables go directly into the GAN, which then produces a room. And we can put that room directly into the dungeon at the space corresponding to the coordinates we just queried. However, you'll notice that some spaces lack a room. We don't want rooms everywhere in the dungeon. And so that is what these auxiliary outputs are for. Among other things, we determine whether or not a room is even present, and also we can determine whether or not there are doors present connecting the room to adjacent rooms, what the types of those doors are, for example, plain, locked, bombable wall, puzzle, locked, things like that. And there's also an output that can be used to determine the start and end locations of the player in the dungeon. Now, we compare this to a control approach called direct-to-GAN, which is basically just evolving a really long linear vector of real valued numbers. Now, to make this work in 2 dimensions, though, we have to have several real valued variables for every room in the dungeon. In particular, we need 10 latent variables and then 6 auxiliary variables, leading to a total of 16 variables per room. And so this linear vector is organized so that the first 16 variables correspond to that room, the next 16 to that room, the next 16 to that room, and so on. And once we go off the end of that row, we come back here and just go through this 2D grid one row at a time. So we're essentially breaking up this linear vector in row major order according to a formula which is shown down here. And so this indicates which index contains the start of the portion of the vector that corresponds to that one room. The auxiliary variables we use are the exact same as used in the CPPNS GAN approach for appropriate comparison. I will say here that when doing both of these approaches with Mario, things are much simpler. Mario only has an X input coordinate because the levels just go from left to right. And with the evolved vectors in direct-to-GAN for Mario, we simply have groups of latent vectors corresponding to each chunk of the Mario level segment. There are no auxiliary variables for Mario. So the experiment we do is to compare these 2 encodings in Mario and Zelda using map elites, generating 50,000 individuals with each experiment. And so we need to define certain bin dimensions for these experiments. In Mario, we use decoration, space coverage, and leniency. These are notions from the literature. And essentially, decoration frequency is just the portion of the level consisting of these tiles. Space coverage is the portion consisting of those tiles. These are significant because they're the ones you can actually stand on. And then leniency is the only one that could be positive or negative. Positive values make the level easier. So question blocks like this give power-ups, therefore they make the level easier. All of these things make the level harder. So there's more of a tendency to have negative values, but positive values are possible with leniency. And then the fitness for the bins is the A-star path length to get through the level. In Zelda, we look at the distribution of wall and water tiles, so the total percentage of those tiles in all the rooms of the dungeon. And then the third dimension is the reachable room count. So in this picture here, some of the rooms have a X on them, indicating that there's no way to reach that room. And even if the room is adjacent to other rooms, there may be no door leading into it, so it is still unreachable. So we want to know how many rooms are actually reachable in this dungeon. And then the fitness value used is the percent of reachable rooms that are in an A-star path from the start to the solution. So moving on to the results, we see that CPPNS GAN quickly outpaces direct-to-GAN in terms of the number of bins that get filled. So CPPNS GAN quickly fills many more bins in both Mario and Zelda. These are 95% confidence intervals, so these are statistically significant differences between those methods. And if we look at example heat maps from individual experiments, we can see what the differences are. So in Mario, we notice that direct-to-GAN has trouble discovering levels with positive leniency, whereas CPPNS GAN has more success in that regard. But even for levels with negative leniency, you'll notice that CPPNS GAN fills out more spaces and generally has brighter colors, meaning higher fitness, than the corresponding locations in direct-to-GAN. The lower right corners in particular are very hard to fill out because space coverage and decoration frequency depend on some of the same tiles, and so it's a bit contradictory for the space coverage to be low and the decoration to be high. The only exception to this is if the level's very hard, meaning that the level is decorated with many, many enemies and has very few places where the player can stand, so low space coverage. Here are some example levels. There's the whole level of a direct-to-GAN, and here's a zoomed-in portion of it. Basically, we see a lot of variety, but no pattern. And with CPPN-to-GAN, we see a repeating pattern, but we do see different patterns. We have this one initially that has the bullet bill stand, and then it shifts to one that lacks that element. So there's a bit of repetition here, which might be considered undesirable. The direct-to-GAN approach is a bit more random, which also has its benefits. So neither is really bad, but there's definitely a distinct qualitative difference. In Zelda, there is a more radical difference between the two approaches. We see that direct-to-GAN has trouble creating dungeons with many reachable rooms. It can't create any more than 65 reachable rooms, and really has trouble going higher than 40 for the most part, whereas CPPN-to-GAN can generate dungeons with 100 reachable rooms or any number of reachable rooms less than that. And even for a smaller number of reachable rooms, we see that CPPN-to-GAN has higher fitness values and generally fills out the bins more in terms of the distribution of water and wall tiles. And if we look at the examples, we get a sense for why. Direct-to-GAN has trouble filling out the dungeon and also has many unreachable rooms in the dungeons. There is a large variety of room layouts, but there's no coherent pattern within the dungeon, and rooms are sort of arbitrarily connected to each other. In contrast, CPPN-to-GAN has a bit more of a cohesive dungeon shape, and we see that rooms of a similar layout tend to be grouped together. So these water rooms have a similar layout, these empty rooms have a similar layout, then we go back to a similar water layout, then back to a similar sort of wall layout on the right side there. So you're going through regions that gradually vary as you explore the dungeon. In general, there are fewer unreachable rooms too. This example has no unreachable rooms. They happen occasionally, but they happen less often with CPPN-to-GAN. It's also possible to find dungeons where we have 100 rooms, the maximum possible in this experiment. And so that is definitely impressive. There's also a lot of cool patterns we get, different types of symmetry that we can see here, repeated motifs, even with variation. And also this example has symmetry, but we also have this pattern which is on both sides. So we get a lot of cool high-level designs. So the question now is, what does this mean, and what do we do with it? So in general, CPPN-to-GAN fills more bins and so we're generating a greater variety of Mario and Zelda levels according to our choice of bins. However, there is maybe more repetition than might be desired, especially in Mario, but to some extent in Zelda as well. And that seems to be due to our particular choice of bin dimensions. We didn't pick bin dimensions that specifically enforce the notion of variation within the dungeon itself. And in fact, if you have a target, say, water percentage or a target decoration frequency, an easy way to achieve that is to make one segment or chunk match that and then repeat it everywhere. However, I will say that some preliminary experiments show that if you have bin dimensions that explicitly look for variation within the dungeon, then CPPN-to-GAN can enforce that as well. Either way, CPPN-to-GAN is creating much more aesthetic global patterns in contrast to direct-to-GAN, which has more chaotic layouts and, in the case of the dungeons, more unreachable rooms. So things that we can do from here. One idea is to do a hybrid encoding that takes the benefits of both. So we could start with CPPNs, evolve for a while to get a nice high-level pattern, and then at some point we simply throw the CPPN away but keep evolving the vectors to get variation in individual places throughout the dungeon. I already mentioned the possibility of changing the bin dimensions, and a more ambitious goal we could also pursue would be to train the whole CPPN-GAN combination from end to end using backprop instead of using evolution on the CPPN part. We're also looking for other application areas. Two games where we could apply this would be Candy Crush or Minecraft, because they involve both sort of high-level global patterns as well as small-level local patterns. So it would probably be a good fit for this approach. But we're interested in other areas as well, maybe robotics or even something else. So I'd like to end by acknowledging that the researchers who worked on this met and did a lot of this work at the Schloss Dagstuhl seminar on revolutions in game AI. And we're very thankful to the Schloss Dagstuhl team for making that possible. And I'll end by showing you, these are my collaborators, Vanessa and Sebastian. If you have any questions, you can reach me at that address. And I encourage you to go check out our source code, this GitHub repo. Please do email me or post issues on the repo if you have any questions about how to use this. Thank you very much.